But he's being a sweetheart and grabbing me a beer. You got to love that. He might get a T-shirt for that. I think that's a distinct possibility. Here he comes. Look at this. Got an MGD, I believe, in the hands. Look at this guy. Let's give Zack Elwood a round of applause, everybody. Yeah, Brewski. Oh, look at that. Look at that. Yeah, we're on right now. Commercial break ended, and almost perfect timing. I was just introducing you, and now he's here. Zack Elwood. What's up, Zach?
Hey,
Good to see you.
not much. Thank you.
You can put the headphones on if you want to.
Headphones?
Just for fun. If you like. You don't have to. But
I don't have to? Does it help?
it helps you hear a little bit.
Okay.
Yeah. So, look at this. Everybody's bringing me booze on the show now. You got to love it.
I'm going to take them off. I don't need
Okay, fair enough. All right. Well, Zach, of course, following up your last great book, we now have a Verbal Poker Tells book.
Yeah, I'll show it. Can I show it here?
Oh, absolutely.
Verbal
yeah.
Poker Tells.
Verbal Poker Tells right there.
There it is.
There you go. So tell us a little bit about the making of this book, because I know that you were watching a lot of TV. I kept seeing your tweets about, the build up to this thing. Tell us about writing this one.
It was a pretty long process. I've worked on it pretty much full time every day for probably like 8 or 9 months total.
Wow.
I was taking a lot of notes of televised poker. I was also playing a lot of 2-5 and 1-2 games, taking a lot of notes there. And I also got a lot of people sending me, people I trusted, sending me hand histories of, verbal behavior that they witnessed. But a lot of the stuff in the book is from televised poker, like WSOP hands, high stakes poker hands, stuff from those kinds of shows. Specifically from a lot of it's from recreational players. I focus on them because they're the ones most likely to give reliable kind of patterns like that. Mm. But yeah, it was a pretty hard process. I actually thought I'd be done a lot sooner, but I didn't factor in like how complicated the project was. As it went on, I kept noticing new stuff and being like, oh, I should include this, or I should rephrase the introduction. I kept stuff kept getting more and more complex the more and more notes I took and the more and more patterns I found. But I'm actually much more proud of this one than I am of the first one, because this one's like much more researched, I feel like, and the first one was much more about general stuff and didn't really delve into specific patterns that you could check on your own. But this one, I feel like I give references for televised poker shows that if you wanted to, you could look them up and watch how the pattern played out on your own if you wanted to.
So with this book, what made you decide that you wanted to take this route with it? I think this is a topic that we do talk a little bit of. A lot of books have talked about verbal tells, but not a whole book's worth, and it mostly leans toward the physical side of it. So what made you decide to get into this side of it and put this book out?
Well, I guess after I wrote the first one, I had already decided, I'm not really going to write another book unless I have something unique to say. Mm-hmm. And I brainstormed a bit about what that could be, and I figured there really hadn't been any book concentrating specifically on verbal tells, and so it struck me as like the one area where nobody had ever really written much about that. I mean, there'd been a few things here and there, like Mike Caro said some stuff, everybody knows a few basic things, but it struck me that nobody really delved into that, and tried to do some hardcore research into that. So that was really like the one area where I thought, I could say something unique here, and something that was interesting. Mm-hmm. That's kind of how it came up, And also, I guess I'd brainstorm with some video projects, but the thing with video is it's hard for me to get the rights to actually use a lot of footage, so that kind of hamstrung me in that direction. So I was like, oh, what can I write about that I can actually write about?
Right, exactly.
So, or what can I do that I can actually do easily? And the more I thought about it, and the more I analyzed stuff, it seemed like verbal poker tells was the way to go.
So let's talk about some of the different breakdowns of the book. Now, unfortunately, I didn't get to see it yet. It's just hot off the presses.
Hot off the presses.
Beautiful. Look at that.
It's a nice looking book. I hired a designer to. You can't tell the subtlety that's in the design there, but the whole cover is basically a bunch of phrases, a bunch of things people say with just part of it highlighted in the spade shape.
Oh,
so
very
it's
nice.
Yeah, you can actually read all these things people say on the cover, but it's subtle. Yeah. So.
I want to start with silence.
Silence.
I know this, you're talking about verbal poker tells, but silence sometimes is just as important as what people are saying at the table, too. How much did you hit silence in the book?
See, I mean, silence is obviously much harder to read than actual things people say, because, the reason for that is because a person with a strong hand can act in very different ways, a variety of ways. They can be silent, they can talk in many different ways because they're relaxed, right? Mm-hmm. So silence in itself is very hard to draw conclusions from, and this is true of a lot of behavior, because usually there's the absence of a tell is not a tell. So without a tell being present, it's really hard to reach conclusions about it, right? If somebody's silent, they could just be being silent for many different reasons, right? Mm-hmm. They could be nervous, or they just could be relaxed, and that's what they're doing now. So in a vacuum, many things are hard to draw conclusions from. I do talk about silence a little bit, but it's mainly in context of player-specific correlation. For example, we've all played with players who talk a lot when they're comfortable. Say they make a big bet on the river, they're very comfortable, and they talk a lot. And then when they're uncomfortable, when they're bluffing, they have more of a tendency to clam up. They might say one or two sentences, but they're not nearly as
animated,
flowing,
and exciting,
exuberant, and willing to interact. That kind of thing. So mainly silence comes up in that regard. But I do make it a point in the book that the absence of a tell is not a tell in itself. Usually, because a player with a strong hand, it's mainly due to the fact that a player with a strong hand can act many different ways. So usually we're looking for, the presence of something, especially when it comes to verbal stuff. We're looking for the presence of something actually being there, mm-hmm. which often will clue you in to somebody having a hand, because a lot of verbal behavior will clue you into somebody being relaxed by how they phrase things, when they say things, how they say them, how quickly they say them after you ask them a question. It's all these little clues, and that's kind of what I delve into.
So, going through all of this, I can only imagine how many different tells you dug up. Let's start with some of the shocking ones that you found. I'm sure there were a few that you saw that you're just like, wow, where did that come from? I can't believe this. What are some of the ones that really specific ones that you found that really surprised you?
I guess I can't say they were really that surprising, but I guess when you really start paying attention to a lot of this stuff, because when I first started out writing this book, I thought I knew what I was going to say, right? And I was like, oh, I have these things to say. I'm going to research what I have to say and then write about it. But the more I started analyzing things, I found new things to say, and I found the things that I was going to say weren't as interesting. So I started having new concepts. So, for example, when I first started really keying into the fact that a player betting with a weak hand virtually never wants to imply a weakness about their hand. They don't want to make what I call a weak hand statement. That a bluffer doesn't want to say something like, "I could be bluffing here. You should call." That kind of thing. It's what I call a weak hand statement. Or they don't want to say something like, "Well, I don't have trips here." They don't want to weaken their range in any way usually. And when you really start keying into that, you'll notice that those kinds of weak hand statements are almost always from players who have strong hands. And it seems kind of obvious in hindsight, the more you think about it, because players who are bluffing don't want to weaken their range. But the more you start keying into it, you'll notice these kinds of subtle and unsubtle statements come up all the time where, you'll ask a player oh, did you hit that straight there? And he's like, no, I didn't hit the straight, the fact that he's willing to subtract a strong hand from his range, after he bet, makes it very likely he's strong, because mm-hmm. a bluffer virtually will never, there's rare exceptions, obviously, like with anything with behavior, but for the most part, a bluffer does not want to subtract value hands from his range, you know. So it shows the value of like these kind of like little questions you can ask players sometimes, you know, like, oh, did you hit that? Did you hit that straight on me? And they're like, no, I didn't get that, you know. So yeah, that's important, and that's kind of like a recurring theme in the book. Like I bring up other patterns too, but a lot of it comes down to that that specific pattern, and that was interesting because like even though it seems kind of obvious in hindsight, like when you really start studying a lot of these, you hardly ever find anybody who's bluffing, you know, making a weak hand statement, and a lot of them can be very subtle too. You know, a lot of them are very subtle where it's like you ask somebody like if they bet on the river, you know, and they'll say something like, well, I don't have the, you know, the trips or whatever, even if it's like the third nuts. It's not the nuts, but it may be like another value hand that's not nearly the nuts. But the fact that they're willing to remove that value hand from their range, you know, with their verbal behavior is meaningful, you know, usually for most recreational players. That's the caveat, because obviously experienced players are very capable of switching up behavior. But
Is it best when somebody asks you one of those questions to just not say anything, or, you know, what's your recommendation? You know, because I mean we know Daniel Negreanu, for example,
Right.
is one of the best
yeah,
at just sitting there, and he'll ask you an innocuous question, and then all of a sudden gets you going, and now he knows everything about you and knows how to play you and can pick you off and figure out exactly what's happening just by starting a casual conversation.
right.
Is it best to just sit there and say, "Oh, hi, Daniel," and then that's it, or how do you what do you find?
I would say, I mean, a lot of it depends on how good you think you are, and you know how much you are into your opponent's head. But usually, I think the game theory optimal solution would be to not say anything, because you're not giving anything away with your silence, assuming you're being silent in all situations, right? But I think one of the cool things about my book is it does give you that sense of like what are these very good players getting from recreational players when they talk. You know, it kind of helps explain, you know, why players like Daniel Negreanu or, you know, Phil Hellmuth or whoever, how are they judging from people's reactions to their verbal behavior? What information are they gleaming from the interaction? You know, and I think that was kind of my goal setting out, is like, what are the subtle nuances that really good players are gathering from recreational players when they interact with them? You know, yeah. So I think yeah. To answer your question, I think silence is often the best response, unless you have a good read on like how that person's going to respond to you. You know.
What did you see from some of the top professionals that really surprised you in terms of their verbal tells that you picked up? Because obviously you've seen all these scenarios through, you know, I looked and I just real quick, I saw 2007. So obviously you went back a long way on this. Yeah. What did you see out of some of the pros that you were like, wow, that is a pretty bad tell they've got?
Well, the interesting thing is, like, and I say in a foreword to this, you know, if I include examples of your verbal behavior, it's not in an insulting way, because what happens a lot is you'll find behaviors that pros do that, you know, if they specifically do these behaviors because they know that their opponent is recreational, right? They know that they're going to get a certain response. They would never do that kind of thing to another very good player, but they can expect that their behavior is going to have a certain response against this certain recreational player. So a lot of the examples I use are actually pros slipping, in the sense that they're using imbalanced verbal behavior against recreational players who can't take advantage of that. But the pros know they can't take advantage of that. The pros would, you know, the good players would never use that same behavior against somebody else who was just as good as them, right?
So they're kind of letting it, because they're not going against a professional.
Right.
They're letting some of these things slide.
Yeah.
That normally they wouldn't do.
And right, exactly. And to an objective observer, you know, somebody who's a good player also, you can be like, well, that they seem to have slipped there. But the person saying that, you know, knows what they're doing, so they're balancing their behavior because they know the expected result that they're getting. So a lot of the examples, even though I use some examples from Negreanu in there, but the thing is, like, a lot of times he's talking to recreational players, you know. So the trick is, you know, he's professional, he's experienced, he's an experienced player. he would not be using those against someone who he thought was experienced, right? So, the value is that if you had that knowledge, you would be like, oh, here's how he's trying to use that verbal behavior against me, or whatever, his behavior against me. So yeah, I use a lot of one of the interesting things about I study a lot of old televised footage, and Phil Locke was a very talkative player, but he was very well balanced. Like I studied his stuff a lot.
I never hear those words go together, Phil Locke and well balanced.
Well, verbal,
First
only
time.
verbal behavior wise, only verbal behavior, because he he's a guy who talks a lot. So I actually spent some time like studying, because I had recorded, I typed like verbatim what these guys said, and I actually logged like specific patterns that I was looking for. And I was like, well, can I find a pattern with how Phil Locke speaks? Does he say like weak hand things when he has strong hands, or does he say strong hand things when he has weak hands? These kinds of like patterns. But the thing is, like, Phil Locke was actually super balanced, and I can't say that about many other players I studied, because I can find many imbalances with how Negreanu uses language. I could find many imbalances with Helmuth. Keeping in mind that they were speaking to recreational players, so. They were trying to exploit people specifically, but Locke was, he was very balanced with his language, and it surprised me that he didn't have any, he was all over the place with his language, and which equals, being balanced.
What was the most interesting verbal duel that you heard between two top professionals that you studied?
Well,
you're smiling. There's probably a couple that
there's
came
a
to
lot.
mind.
There's a lot of interesting ones. Like, yeah, I mean, because I spent a lot of time thinking about which ones I would give more, exposure to, and like there's one in here I talk about, like it's a well-known one. It actually had a few patterns in it, which it's the well-known one when in high stakes poker, when Negreanu has 10 king and Esfandiari has pocket jacks, and the flop's like queen 10 some lower card. And Negreanu shoves all in the flop. It was a pretty mundane spot, but there were like several verbal patterns in there, and I actually kept coming back to it in the book, because I felt like Negreanu showed several patterns that were exploitable, like that many people show. And I revisit that hand 3 times in the book, and it's the same hand in Harrington's book, where he breaks it down, like Harrington's volume 1, I think, of No Limit Cash Games. It's like a bestseller of his books. He talks about that hand, in his verbal behavior part as an example of like the kind of information you give away. But like he didn't delve very far into, I specifically call out like 3 specific patterns that were present, and that could have given information to Esfandiari if he was, that could have possibly been, factors in him calling in that hand. And I think there's value to like breaking down any possible poker hand into these like really subtle, pieces, because I think there's so much subtle information you can find in this verbal behavior, and the more in depth you examine it, the more you can find sometimes. A lot of times, when you're playing against experienced players, you have to take into account that they could be leveling you in various ways, of course. But like when you apply it to recreational players, I think there's a lot of value there. And even sometimes if you have a good read on experienced players, there can be good information there. But
I think high stakes poker was probably the most fun show for verbal interactions that you're going to find with those professionals. Obviously, very few amateurs got on that show. I know, I'm trying to remember back if there was a lot of verbal on the 7 deuce hand. That's the legendary 7 deuce hand between Helmuth and Mattisau. I don't know if you.
Oh yeah, where he bluffs with and Mattisau folds kings.
Yeah.
I didn't include that one, but I did include a lot of other hands featuring Helmuth, and actually I got a lot of Farhall hands in there, because I felt like Farhall was super unbalanced with his language. Speaking of people that are imbalanced or balanced with their language, like there's a good amount of Farhall hands in there. Trying to think. I mean, I went on my way to study the more amateur players that played on there. Like, trying to think of another more amateur player that not that I'm calling Farrell amateur, but the people that were not as serious, I guess I should say.
That's on there, like Guy La Liberté, and
Guy La Liberté. Yeah, I use a few La Liberté examples. and I say in the forward, this is not an insulting thing in any means. Like I use a lot of names from a lot of people actually, and like who knows, if you've played a WSOP event or something, you might be in there. Anybody could be in there.
Yeah.
I put a lot of names in there because I like to like document what I did. But yeah, it's not an insulting way because we all leak information in different ways. It's just being aware of like how you might be influencing your opponent and how much they might know. We all sometimes talk during hands, and we have to be aware of what could that be meaning to our opponent.
Yeah. Well, I can't wait to read this book because Poker Tells is one of my favorite things, and I loved your first book. And I got to tell you, you really won a lot of people over with the first book. I mean, it seemed to me that all of us, we knew who you were, but then when that book came out and started making the rounds and people really started reading it, it just seemed like it snowballed and snowballed for you, and more people were going to you for advice and looking to you in terms of Poker Tells, and it kind of put you in that little stratosphere there with Caro and Joe Navarro and yourself, with some of the best Poker Tell books out there. What was that experience like for you over the past couple of years since you wrote the first book?
It was pretty weird. Honestly, I'm not really anybody. I'm somebody who I've played poker seriously and studied it, seriously on and off for 10 years, and I played professionally for 3 of those years. But it's not like I'm a super high stakes player or anything. I've never represented myself as a genius at poker, but it was more like I really thought the Poker Tells information that was out there was really subpar, and that's kind of what motivated me to be like, well, I feel like I could write a better book on this, and I feel like I've, with what I know, I could go out and write a better book, and so that's what motivated me. It wasn't like some thought like I'm a genius at this stuff. It was more like I think there's more to be said on the subject that people aren't talking about, for whatever reason. It could be because they're playing. The guys who really know Poker Tells are just playing so much poker and making so much money at the high stakes that they don't really want to talk about it. That could be one reason, and that's fine. But it just struck me that nobody's really talking about this stuff in a way that's really intelligent, like breaking it down into like patterns. So that's what motivated me. I felt like maybe I could be that guy. And when I wrote the first book, I didn't know how people would react. I self-published it. I just wanted to see what would happen. If people liked it, and people responded positively, so that gave me more confidence, and it kind of led me into. That's what led me to this book. I'm like, well, if I'm going to write another book, it has to be something special. So that's what led into it, and then, I was really honored that people thought it was valuable. I did spend a lot of time on it, and I thought I had confidence in it, but I wasn't sure if other people would feel the same way. So, but I think what I had going for me was just like there's just not that much good information out there about Poker Tells, and honestly, it's not that it's not like I pretend it's a very important subject. It's like it can add some percentage to your win rate, sure. It's not a big deal, but it can add a substantial amount to your win rate if you pay attention to it, and if you think about it. So yeah, that's how I've approached it,
Pretty cool, dude. As the kids like to say, pretty cool.
Pretty cool.
All
cool
right.
Story, bro.
Yeah. So we've got the new book out here. It is Verbal Poker Tells by Zack Elwood, and boy, I can't wait to get my hands on this, man. I'm
gonna bring you one tomorrow.
Okay.
I'll get you one.
Awesome. I appreciate it.
I got a few in the car, so.
All right. So, book out on Amazon yet and everything ready to go?
It's everywhere online. The only place the ebook is available is on my website, readingpokertells.com. Yeah, that's pretty much right now the only place you can buy it. I'll eventually get it up on 2+2. They said they're going to sell the ebook, but right now you can buy the ebook, several different files on my website. But yeah, the paperback's on every major online seller. So.
All right. So pick it up. Everybody,
right.
You loved the first one. You're going to love this one, Verbal Poker Tells by Zack Elwood. Zack, congratulations on another great piece of work, man.
Thanks, man. Thanks for having me.
Very awesome.
Appreciate it, man.
Very awesome. We'll see you around here at the World Series.
All right.
There you go, everybody. Zack Elwood. He's back. I cannot wait to read this book. Save myself some more money. Zack saved me some money last time around, and so it's definitely worth it. All right. So